A survivor stood before Congress and broke her silence for the first time in decades. Her voice shook as she recounted horrors that powerful people tried to bury forever. But what happened next sent shockwaves through Washington that nobody saw coming. Because Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't just listen to her story. She turned that pain into a weapon against the entire system that allowed it to happen. And what she revealed about missing files, suspicious prison transfers, and protected names is about to blow this case wide open all over again.
And honestly, we heard the story of at least one person that has never come forward before today. This was the very first time that she was telling anyone in a semi-public way her story. And if I had to summarize the theme, I would say that their theme was to do something. It is probably the theme of the American people in general right now when it comes to government, is that they want us to do something. So yes, we have the roundtable, but they actually want to see some action. The fact that this started off in the 90s and we had someone who could talk about what happened to them in the 90s, but then you go down the line and you've got somebody that's telling us their story from 2008. These failures led to years and years of abuse that did not have to take place. And so the reality is this. Some think that this is all over and some think that nothing else is going on. But if there was ever a RICO case, it would have been the Epstein case. So how we went from something that should have been RICO because of how sophisticated of a system this was. And this wasn't just one little sick old man that was doing stuff, but there were so many layers, whether we're talking about the banks that were involved, whether we're talking about those that worked for him, that helped him, whether we're talking about the monster known as Maxwell. And that's exactly how y'all need to refer to her. She is a monster. She is not a victim. So let me tell you, I want some action items to come out of this because for once we somewhat look like we're bipartisan in the oversight committee. Number one, we need answers. We need answers on why it is that Maxwell was transferred from her current station or her former station in Florida down to Texas. We need to have an understanding because everything that I heard today leads me to know that for sure she was all up and in and through this entire process. Not to mention that she was indicted by a jury of her peers and then she was tried and convicted and given 20 years. So why is it that we had somebody, again, it almost seems like we are doomed to repeat our failures, because why is it we have high level people that seemingly are running cover for a criminal? And that is what she is. She is a monster and she is a criminal. So number one, we need answers on what happened with that transfer, why it took place. And honestly, we all need to stand together and say that Maxwell needs to go back to where the monsters go, which is to a higher level of security. We also need to understand that Debbie Wasserman Schultz has legislation that she has been trying to push forward. And so in a bipartisan way, we all need to get behind Debbie, because we found and what we learned is that there were loopholes as it relates to the Crime Victims Act. And so we've got to make sure that no other victims suffer in the way that they did when you have somebody like Alex Acosta that decides that he wants to play games and dismiss a case and never inform the victims of what's going on as is required by law. So we are going to have to fix those loopholes to make sure that that doesn't happen, because it took them 10 years of fighting this. And ultimately, by the time they got to the end of it, well, it also was Jeffrey Epstein's end. And so there was not a resolution for that. And the final thing that I think that we need to do is obviously we need to continue to push forward and make sure that we get all the files, because we know that we have not received them all. Because I am standing in front of the press, I'm also going to make a plea. One of the things that I realized was that there's a lot of stuff that the DOJ may have, but honestly, if you don't have a thorough investigation, and I can't say if we had a thorough investigation or not, we have no idea. But the reality is that when you have investigators that go out and they collect information. I am not necessarily convinced that they even have gone out and done their due diligence to fully investigate this case in the first place. So if there's anyone in the public that believes that you have information that would be valuable, you've never been able to get through to federal agencies, or no one would listen to you when you try to go forward and bring information forward, I am asking that you trust oversight DIMS and you bring that information to.
The hearing room went silent when the woman started speaking. This wasn't just another political testimony. This was someone who had carried these secrets since the 1990s, never telling a soul in any public way until that moment. Crockett sat forward as the survivor described a network so sophisticated, so carefully constructed, that it operated for decades without consequence. But here's what made Crockett's response different from every other politician who'd touched this case. She didn't offer sympathy and move on. She broke down exactly how the system failed and named the people responsible for those failures. Crockett revealed something that most Americans don't realize. The Epstein case wasn't about one sick predator acting alone. It was a RICO-level operation involving banks that moved the money, employees who handled logistics, and powerful individuals who looked the other way. She said it plainly, if there was ever a RICO case, this would be it. That's not political rhetoric. That's a legal framework that prosecutes entire criminal organizations, not just individuals. And the fact that nobody pursued it that way tells you everything about who was being protected. The timeline Crockett laid out was damning. Survivors from the 1990s sat in that room alongside someone describing abuse from 2008. Think about that. 2 decades of victims, 2 decades of failures, 2 decades of a system that chose powerful reputations over vulnerable children. Every agency that could have stopped it didn't. Every prosecutor who could have thrown the book at him chose deals instead. And every file that could expose the full truth remains locked away from public view. But then Crockett dropped a bombshell that nobody in the media was talking about. Ghislaine Maxwell, the woman convicted by a jury and sentenced to 20 years for her role in this operation, was quietly transferred from a Florida prison to a low-security facility in Texas. And this wasn't just any move. It violated Standard Bureau of Prisons policy that keeps sex offenders in low-security, not minimum-security facilities. Crockett demanded answers. Who approved this transfer? Why did it happen? And who benefits from Maxwell being somewhere less visible and less monitored? Here's what makes it even more suspicious. The transfer happened shortly after Maxwell had a 9-hour meeting with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche at the prison. 9 hours. What could possibly require that much time with a convicted accomplice unless something bigger was being discussed? Victims of Epstein immediately called it out, saying the move smacks of a cover-up. Because when you're serving 20 years for enabling one of the most notorious criminals in modern history, you don't get moved to a cushier prison without someone powerful pulling strings. Crockett called Maxwell exactly what she is. A monster, not a victim, not misunderstood, a monster. And she demanded that Maxwell be sent back to a high-security facility where she belongs. Because this isn't about rehabilitation or second chances. This is about accountability for someone who spent years recruiting and manipulating young girls into a nightmare they'll never fully escape. Every day Maxwell spends in a minimum security prison is an insult to those survivors. But the roots of this cover-up go back even further than most people realize. In 2008, Alex Acosta cut a deal with Epstein that let him serve just 13 months in county jail with work release privileges. Let that sink in. A man facing potential life in federal prison for abusing dozens of underage girls got to leave jail during the day to go to his office. And the sweetheart deal didn't just protect Epstein. It granted immunity to all of his co-conspirators, shielding powerful people from ever being charged. Crockett exposed the legal loopholes that made this possible. The Crime Victims' Rights Act requires that victims be notified and have a say in plea agreements. But Acosta never told them. He dismissed the case without informing a single survivor that their abuser was getting off easy. It took those victims 10 years of legal battles just to find out what happened. And by the time they got answers, Epstein was dead, and justice became impossible. Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz has been trying to close those loopholes for years, but her legislation keeps getting buried. Crockett made it clear that fixing this isn't optional anymore. If we don't close these gaps, another prosecutor in another case will use the same playbook to protect another powerful criminal. The system that failed these survivors is still in place, still functional, still protecting the people it was designed to protect. And it's not the victims. Now here's the part that should terrify everyone. Congress still hasn't received all the Epstein files from the Department of Justice. After years of investigations, hearings, and public outcry, the full story remains hidden. Crockett admitted something that should make headlines everywhere. She said she's not convinced the DOJ ever conducted a thorough investigation in the first place. They may have collected information, but whether they followed every lead, interviewed every witness, or pursued every connection is a completely different question. So Crockett did something unprecedented. She made a direct appeal to the public, bypassing federal agencies entirely. If you have information, if you tried to come forward before and got ignored, if you have documents or evidence that could matter, bring it to the Congressional Oversight Committee. She essentially told the American people that if the DOJ won't investigate properly, Congress will. That's not normal. That's a lawmaker admitting that the institutions meant to deliver justice cannot be trusted to do so. And it gets worse. The Trump administration came into office promising transparency about the Epstein files. Supporters believed that this time, the powerful names would finally be exposed. But Attorney General Pam Bondi recently flipped the script entirely. She claimed there's no Epstein client list to release. Not sealed, not classified, just doesn't exist. Which is a fascinating statement considering the FBI raided Epstein's properties and seized computers, hard drives, and documents. Either the most notorious sex trafficker in modern history kept no records, or someone is lying about what they found. Crockett and other Democrats have repeatedly tried to force the files into public view. They introduced amendments to appropriations bills that would have declassified the documents and made them available for everyone to see. And every single time, Republicans blocked it, not debated it, not amended it, blocked it entirely. Crockett called them out directly, accusing GOP members of showing loyalty to powerful figures instead of transparency for the American people. Even Thomas Massie, a Republican congressman, introduced a bill to release the files. His own party buried it. Think about that. A Republican pushing for transparency and Republican leadership refusing to let it move forward. When both sides of the aisle have members demanding the same thing, but leadership on one side keeps obstructing, you have to ask what they're protecting. Because 89% of Americans, across all political affiliations, want those files released. Politicians are ignoring a nearly unanimous public demand, and that only happens when the truth threatens people in power. There are whispers in Washington that the White House itself intervened behind the scenes. Crockett hinted that someone's arm got twisted to kill the push for transparency. If that's true, it means this cover-up extends beyond just one agency or one party. It means the highest levels of government are coordinating to keep these names buried. And every day that goes by without answers, public trust erodes a little more. The banks involved in moving Epstein's money have never been held accountable. The employees who scheduled his flights, managed his properties, and facilitated his operations have never been charged. The powerful individuals who flew on his planes, visited his properties, and appeared in his records have never been named publicly. Crockett laid out this entire network and pointed out that it still exists. Different names, maybe, but the same structure of complicity and silence. She said something in that hearing that will define how history remembers this moment. People don't want speeches. They want action. And she's absolutely right. Americans are exhausted by press conferences that lead nowhere, investigations that get buried, and promises of accountability that never materialize. This hearing wasn't about grandstanding. It was about demanding that the system finally delivers what it's supposed to deliver: justice. But justice doesn't happen automatically. It requires pressure, attention, and people refusing to let the story die. That's why Crockett's call to the public matters so much. She's not asking people to trust the DOJ or wait for federal agencies to do the right thing. She's asking people to bypass them entirely and bring evidence directly to Congress. That's a recognition that the institutions designed to protect us have been compromised by the very power they were supposed to check. Survivors of Epstein's abuse have been fighting for over 30 years to be heard, to be believed, and to see some form of justice. Some of them testified for the first time at this hearing, carrying trauma that most people can't even imagine. Crockett honored them by turning their testimony into action items, close the legal loopholes, move Maxwell back to high security, get answers about the DOJ investigation, subpoena Pam Bondi and make her testify under oath about what she knows. These aren't abstract goals. These are concrete steps that could actually happen if enough pressure is applied, and that's the lesson here. The powerful don't give up their secrets willingly. They don't release files out of goodness. They don't prosecute their own unless forced to. Every piece of accountability in this case has come because survivors refuse to stay silent and because a handful of lawmakers like Crockett refuse to let it go. The moment the public stops paying attention, the moment the pressure fades, is the moment this story gets buried for good. So here's the uncomfortable truth. The Epstein case isn't closed. It's not resolved. It's not in the past. It's happening right now in the form of sealed files, transferred prisoners, blocked amendments, and protected names. The system that enabled decades of abuse is still operating. The people who looked away are still in power, and the structures that prioritized reputation over justice haven't been dismantled. Crockett ended her remarks with a promise. We don't care who's in those files. We're coming for you. That statement is either the beginning of real accountability, or it's another line that gets forgotten when the news cycle moves on. Which one it becomes depends entirely on whether people keep demanding answers, whether they keep asking why Maxwell got moved, why the files remain sealed, why co-conspirators were given immunity, why survivors had to wait decades just to be heard. This isn't a story about one scandal. It's a story about whether justice in America applies equally or whether wealth and power can still buy silence. It's about whether transparency is a right or a privilege, and it's about whether the public will settle for press conferences and promises or demand the action that Crockett says survivors deserve. Because at the end of the day, the only thing separating accountability from cover-up is attention. The moment we stop watching is the moment they win.